Hello and welcome to Business English Podcast today. We're diving deep into a skill that can really boost your career, mastering professional interruption phrases.
It's interesting, isn't it? We're often told not to interrupt. But in the business world, knowing how and when to speak up can be crucial.
It definitely is. Think about it, you see a mistake happening, but hesitate to speak up. It turns out a whopping 71% of employees have been in that exact situation. And get this, companies are losing an average of $62.4 million each year because poor communication.
That's a huge cost, both financially and in terms of missed opportunities. And here's the thing, 82% of CEOs actually want their employees to interrupt if something's wrong.
So it's not about staying silent, it's about mastering the art of the professional interruption. To help us do that, we'll be exploring some key areas today, starting with the golden rules of interrupting. We'll also dive into building your interruption toolkit and learn how to harness the power of voice.
We're going to look at real-world scenarios where these techniques have made a real difference. Plus, we'll cover what to do when things don't go as planned. And in today's global business world, we can't forget about technology and international considerations.
It's going to be a fascinating journey. But first, let's lay the groundwork. Why are interruptions so important in a professional setting?
It's all about timing. Mastering interruptions isn't about being disruptive or constantly stealing the spotlight. It's about knowing when to speak up, potentially preventing costly errors, and ultimately helping your team and companies succeed.
I've heard stories about seemingly small oversights costing companies millions later down the line. Imagine you're a junior developer and notice a flaw in a $1 million proposal. Would you have the confidence to interrupt and speak up?
That takes courage, but it could save the company from a disaster. It highlights why those golden rules are so important. One concept our sources highlight is what they call the triple threat of interruption dynamics.
Okay, let's unpack this triple threat. What does that mean?
It refers to the three key factors that come into play during any interruption: your physical presence, how you present yourself virtually, and the cultural expectations of the situation.
So it's not just about what you say, but how you say it and the context surrounding the interruption.
Exactly. Let's start with that first element, physical presence. If you're in a face-to-face meeting, think about your body language. Are you leaning in slightly, making eye contact? These nonverbal cues can signal your intention to speak and make you harder to ignore.
It makes sense. So even before we utter a word,
Yeah.
we're already communicating our desire to interrupt.
Precisely. Now let's move to virtual presence. This becomes crucial in online meetings, where visual cues might be limited. You need to be even more deliberate with your timing and wording.
So, in a way,
Yeah.
the stakes are higher in virtual settings because we have to rely more on our words to convey our message and intentions.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the third element of the triple threat, cultural expectations. Different cultures have different norms around interrupting. What might be seen as assertive and appropriate in one culture could be considered rude in another.
That's a really important point. So how can we navigate these different dynamics effectively? Is there a rule of thumb we can follow?
There's a useful guideline called the 2-minute rule. Essentially, you give yourself 120 seconds to decide if your interruption is truly necessary. Ask yourself, is this information crucial to the discussion? Could it impact the outcome of the meeting? If the answer is yes, then it might be worth speaking up.
I like that. It's a simple yet effective way to assess the situation and make a judgment call. But how do we apply this 2-minute rule in different settings? A board meeting versus a casual team brainstorming session, for example.
That's where the context comes in. In a board meeting, your interruption should have a major impact, potentially affecting the bottom line. In a team meeting, the bar might be lower, but you still want to ensure your contribution adds value to the discussion.
So the importance of the information and the potential consequences should guide our decision to interrupt. It's about being strategic, not just impulsive. But what about the way we interrupt? Does that matter as much as the decision to interrupt itself?
Absolutely. Our sources emphasize that successful interruptions are 70% timing and 30% wording in face-to-face settings. But here's the interesting part. That ratio flips in virtual meetings, where wording becomes even more critical.
That's fascinating. It highlights the unique challenges of online communication. Without those visual cues, we have to be extra careful with our language.
Exactly. And that's where having a toolkit of professional interruption phrases can be incredibly valuable. But before we delve into those specific phrases, let's introduce a framework for categorizing different types of interruptions. Think of it as a traffic light system.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this traffic light system.
Imagine a traffic light. with green, yellow, and red signals. Green light interruptions are those urgent situations where you absolutely must speak up. Maybe you've spotted a critical error or have time-sensitive information that could impact a decision. Yellow light interruptions are more about seeking clarification or adding information that could influence the direction of the conversation. And red light interruptions, those are the ones that require careful consideration and tactful phrasing, maybe challenging a point or offering a different perspective.
I love that analogy. It's such a simple and memorable way to categorize different interruption scenarios. So green is for urgency, yellow is for clarification, and red is for those more sensitive or potentially controversial interruptions.
Precisely. And just like navigating traffic, knowing when to go proceed with caution or stop can make all the difference in how your interruption is received.
It's brilliant. This framework provides a roadmap for not just deciding when to interrupt, but also how to approach different situations with the appropriate level of urgency and tact. But before we move on, I want to emphasize something you mentioned earlier, cultural differences. How can we be mindful of those nuances when interrupting, especially in a global business setting? That's a great question, and it's something we'll explore in more detail later in our deep dive, but for now remember that cultural awareness is key. What might be perfectly acceptable in one culture could be seen as disrespectful in another. It's always a good idea to do your research and understand the specific communication norms of the people you're interacting with.
That's a great reminder. So we've established the golden rules, the triple thread of dynamics, and the 2-minute rule. Now let's get into the practical tools. What are some specific phrases we can use to interrupt professionally in different scenarios?
That's where our interruption toolkit comes in, and we'll be covering that in detail in the next part of our deep dive. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Business English Podcast. We've been unpacking the art of the professional interruption. And now we're about to get into the specifics. It's time to build your interruption toolkit.
Having a repertoire of go-to phrases for different situations can really boost your confidence when you need to speak up.
Absolutely. It's like having the right tools for the job.
Yeah.
But with so many potential scenarios, where do we even begin?
Let's start with those emergency phrases, the ones you use when you absolutely have to interrupt, no matter what. Think of those green light moments where crucial information can't wait.
So if you see a major mistake about to happen, or have time-sensitive data that could change the course of a decision, you need a way to interject immediately, right?
Exactly. One powerful phrase you can use is, I apologize for the interruption, but I have some time-sensitive information that could impact our decision. It's direct, but it also shows respect for the flow of the meeting.
I see what you mean. It acknowledges the interruption while emphasizing the urgency of your information.
Right. And that combination of urgency and respect is key to a successful emergency interruption.
Now, what about email interruptions? We're all drowning in emails these days. So how can we make our messages stand out and actually get a response?
When it's truly urgent, sometimes you need to be a little more assertive in your subject line. Try something like urgent decision needed or time sensitive, action required, followed by a very brief description of the issue.
I've definitely seen subject lines like that.
Yeah.
They definitely grab your attention. But wouldn't that come across as a bit too aggressive for everyday communication?
You're right, you wouldn't want to overuse those kinds of subject lines. But for those critical moments when you need a response quickly, it can be a very effective way to cut through the noise.
It's like sending up a flare. You only use it when it's really important. Now, budget discussions can be a bit tricky. It often feels like every dollar is being scrutinized. What's a good approach for interrupting during those conversations?
You're right. You want to be particularly mindful and tactful in those situations. Instead of directly interrupting, try phrasing it as a request to contribute. Something like, before we finalize these numbers, I have a data point that could impact our projections. Or, may I share an observation about this budget line?
I like that. It's less disruptive and shows respect for the process while still allowing you to get your point across.
And it positions you as someone who's thoughtful and has valuable insights to share, which is always a good impression to make.
Now, technical presentations can sometimes get bogged down in details. How can we interrupt in those situations without derailing the entire presentation?
One effective technique is to find a natural bridge between the current topic and the point you want to make. You might say something like, building on that technical specification, there's a potential compatibility issue we should address.
That's a great example. It's less of an interruption and more of a seamless transition to a related point.
Exactly. You're adding value to the conversation without creating a jarring disruption.
Now, sales meetings can be high-pressure situations. Interrupting at the wrong moment could jeopardize a deal. How do we navigate those delicate conversations?
In sales, it's all about positioning your interruption as a way to benefit the client or add value to the deal. One technique is what our sources call the value-add interruption. You might say something like, "To ensure we're tailoring our solution to your specific needs, I'd like to highlight a recent case study that directly addresses your concerns."
I see how that works. You're not interrupting just for the sake of it. You're offering something valuable that could potentially strengthen the deal.
Precisely. It's about being strategic with your interruptions and always keeping the client's best interests in mind.
This interruption toolkit is already giving me so much more confidence. But it's not just about the words we use, right? Our voices play a crucial role too.
Absolutely. In fact, our voices can make or break an interruption. Even a simple phrase like, "excuse me," can convey completely different meanings depending on your tone of voice.
That's so true. It can sound urgent, polite, or even sarcastic, all depending on how we deliver it. So how can we master the art of using our voices effectively during interruptions?
One powerful technique is interruption breathing. Before you speak up, take a quick silent breath. This does two things. It helps you stay calm and centered, and it allows you to project your voice with more authority.
It's like a mini meditation before you speak up. Just a moment to collect your thoughts and prepare for the interruption.
Exactly. And speaking of preparation, have you ever noticed how even slight accents can sometimes make people pay more attention to what you're saying?
I've definitely noticed that. Why do you think that is?
Studies show that a slight accent can create a sense of novelty or intrigue, making people listen more intently. However, the key is to match the pace of the conversation before you jump in.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about finding that rhythm and flow, and then using your unique voice to add to the conversation.
Precisely. And that becomes even more important when we're talking about phone call interruptions,
Right.
where we don't have those visual cues to rely on.
Phone calls can be tricky. It feels like there's more pressure to get your point across quickly and effectively because you can't see the other person's reactions.
You're right. One technique that can be really helpful for phone interruptions is what we call vocal bookending. Start your interruption with a slightly higher pitch to signal that you're about to speak, and then lower your tone to a more authoritative level when you make your main point.
So it's like creating a vocal framework for your interruption, making it stand out from the rest of the conversation.
Exactly. And for virtual meetings, where audio quality can sometimes be an issue, you can use what we call the volume velocity principle.
Okay, tell me more about this volume velocity idea.
Start speaking at about 70% of your normal volume and gradually increase to 90%. This subtle increase in volume helps draw people's attention to what you're saying, especially if there's background noise or distractions.
It's amazing how these small adjustments to our voices can have such a big impact on how our interruptions are received. Now, we often think of interruptions as breaking the silence. But can silence itself be a powerful tool for interruptions?
Absolutely. Strategic silence, what we call the power pause pattern, can make your interruptions much more impactful. Try using a brief pause before and after your key points.
That's interesting. It's like creating a mental space for your ideas to sink in, giving the listener time to process what you've said.
Exactly. It allows your words to resonate
Yeah.
and prevents you from rushing through your point.
So we've covered the golden rules, the eruption toolkit, and the power of our voices. But how does all of this play out in real-life situations? In the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore real-world scenarios where these techniques have made all the difference. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Business English Podcast. We've been talking about professional interruptions, how to do them well, and the power of your voice. But even with the best preparation, things don't always go perfectly.
That's true. Sometimes our interruptions might not land the way we hoped. But those moments are not disasters. We can actually turn them into opportunities to show grace and even build stronger relationships.
It's all about recovery, isn't it?
Yeah.
Knowing how to handle those situations where things might have gone a bit off track.
Exactly. And one of the most common situations where people get nervous is interrupting the boss. It can feel risky, but it doesn't have to be career suicide.
We all know that sinking feeling when you realize your interruption might not have been the best move. So how do we recover from those awkward moments, especially with someone like our boss?
We have this great example of Michael, a senior manager who found himself in that exact position. He accidentally cut off his boss during a meeting, but instead of panicking, he used what our sources call the AAA protocol.
Okay, AAA protocol. I like the sound of that. What does it stand for?
It stands for acknowledge, articulate, and advance. First, he acknowledged that his interruption might have been poorly timed. Then he clearly articulated why he felt the need to speak up. Finally, he suggested a better time to revisit the point.
That's a really smart approach. It shows self-awareness and respect for everyone's time.
And it turned what could have been a negative situation into a positive one.
Do you happen to remember what he actually said? I'm trying to picture how that played out in the meeting.
He said something along the lines of, "I realized my timing might have been off there. I felt this information was urgent, but perhaps we can circle back to it later in the discussion."
That's a great example. He acknowledged the misstep, explained his reasoning, and proposed a solution, all while remaining calm and professional.
And that's the key. Research actually shows that a well-handled recovery can build even more trust than if the mistake hadn't happened at all.
That's fascinating. It's like showing your human side, owning up to a mistake, and taking steps to correct it.
It's about turning a potential negative into a positive. But there's a catch: you have to act quickly.
How quickly are we talking? Is there a time limit for graceful recovery?
Our sources recommend what they call the 7-second rule. You have about 7 seconds to smooth things over and regain control of the situation.
That makes sense. It's all about that initial response. Linger too long, and the awkwardness can really set in. But what about the impact on the group dynamic? Let's say you interrupt in a team meeting, and it doesn't go well. How do you manage that?
That's where ripple effect management comes in. When you interrupt, it's like dropping a stone in a pond. Those ripples spread out. You need to be aware of how your interruption affects everyone involved.
So it's not just about the person you interrupted. It's about being mindful of the overall team dynamics.
Exactly. And here's where cultural differences become particularly important. What might be a minor ripple in one culture could be a major wave in another.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So how do we navigate those cultural nuances, especially when we're working with global teams?
One technique is the preemptive recovery position. It's about anticipating potential cultural sensitivities and addressing them head on. You might say something like, "I know this might be a bit unconventional, but the urgency of this matter compels me to speak up."
It's like acknowledging that you might be stepping outside of the norm, but justifying it with the importance of your point.
And that can go a long way in preventing misunderstandings or negative reactions.
Now let's talk about technology. The way we work and communicate has changed so much. How does all of this apply to virtual meetings?
That's a great question. We entered the era of platform power plays. Each virtual meeting platform has its own quirks and opportunities.
Yeah, so it's not just about knowing the technology, but knowing how to use it strategically for interruptions.
Exactly. Take Zoom, for example. Have you ever noticed how the reaction emojis can subtly influence the mood of a meeting?
Now that you mention it, I have. People are more likely to respond positively when they see those thumbs up or clapping hands.
Exactly. One executive we interviewed uses what he calls the digital prelude to his advantage. Before he makes a major point, he'll use a sequence of emojis, a chat message, and then a raised hand.
That's so clever. It's like building anticipation and priming the audience for his interruption.
And the chat function itself can be a powerful tool. Think of it as your interruption insurance policy.
I like that. How do you mean?
You can use the chat to signal your point, provide context, or even get support from other participants before making a verbal interruption.
It's like having a back channel to lay the groundwork for your interruption.
And speaking of game changers, artificial intelligence is transforming the way we interrupt.
AI and interruptions. Tell me more about that.
Imagine having an AI tool that transcribes the meeting in real time and highlights key points you could use to support your interruption.
That sounds incredible. It's like having a personal assistant backing you up with data and evidence.
And it's already happening. One of our clients used AI-powered transcription to interrupt a huge virtual conference. It helped her make her point clearly and with authority.
That's a powerful example of how technology can level the playing field and empower anyone to speak up effectively.
It's really amazing to see these tools being used to make meetings more inclusive and productive.
Now we can't forget about hybrid meetings. Those are particularly tricky because you have some people in the room and others joining virtually. How do you handle interruptions in those situations?
It's about being mindful of both the physical and virtual dynamics.
Yeah.
You need to use clear, concise language and make sure everyone, both in the room and online, understands your point.
So it's almost like doing double duty with your communication.
Yeah.
Making sure you're addressing both audiences effectively.
Exactly. And sometimes you might even need to use the chat function to bridge the gap between the physical and virtual participants.
Technology really is changing the game. Now, there's one thing we haven't talked about yet. Those moments when technology fails us, We've all been in meetings where the screen freezes or the audio drops out. Can we actually use those glitches to our advantage?
Absolutely. We call those glitch opportunity windows. When there's a technical disruption, it creates a natural pause in the conversation, a perfect moment to jump in with your point.
It's like turning a potential obstacle into a strategic opening. I love it.
And finally, let's not forget about those times when we need to interrupt a conversation that's happening asynchronously, maybe across time zones. We call that the time zone transcendent technique.
So this is about interrupting those ongoing conversations that are happening outside of a real-time meeting.
Exactly. Think about using email threads, messaging platforms, or project management tools to interject your ideas without disrupting the flow of communication.
It's brilliant because it allows for thoughtful input and collaboration without the immediacy or pressure of a live interruption.
And it can be a great way to ensure that everyone's voice is heard, regardless of their location or time zone.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. We've covered so much ground, from the basics of interruption etiquette to the nuances of cross-cultural communication and the power of technology.
We've learned about the golden rules of interrupting, built our interruption toolkits, and discovered the power of our voices.
And we've explored real-world scenarios, learned how to recover from mishaps, and even discovered how to use technology glitches to our advantage.
It's clear that mastering professional interruptions is a skill that can truly benefit anyone in any field.
Absolutely. It's about having the confidence and the tools to speak up effectively, contribute valuable insights, and ultimately make a positive impact.
And as we wrap up, we want to hear from you. Have you tried any of these techniques? What are your go-to strategies for professional interruptions? Share your experiences and tips in the comments below.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive, please subscribe to our channel and share this episode with your friends and colleagues.
Thank you for joining us on this journey of professional development. We'll see you in the next episode.